All right, welcome everyone. I know some folks are still trickling in, but we're going to get started. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, is located, and who's hosting this series. We want to pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. And as we come together today to bring awareness to the issues of equity and justice, we recognize the Chumash people and so many other indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. We just wanted to be sure to acknowledge that. So I am the director of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. My name is Ben Halpern, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the first of our series of talks focused on advancing ecology and environmental data science for a more just and equitable future. As we all know, the national and international dialogue has turned towards these topics, and our discipline in particular has certainly to share. And this speaker series is just one part of our way to help bring some of these dialogues and communities and awareness together. And I'm really excited for the first talk of this series, and I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin Gaynor to introduce our speaker. So Caitlin, please.
Thanks, Ben. Welcome, everyone. Seems we've got 115 people here already and counting, which is fantastic. Just as a housekeeping point, it's webinar format, so everyone's videos and mic will be off, but please do drop in questions, and we have a Q&A that we'll moderate at the end. So yeah, as questions come up throughout the talk, feel free to leave them there and we'll come back to them. But yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gillian Bowser. She's an interdisciplinary ecologist studying sustainability and the intersections of ecology and society, and has been a tireless advocate for diversity in the sciences. Dr. Bowser has worn many hats in her career, including as a scientist with the National Park Service, a AAAS fellow with the State Department, a consultant with the United Nations Global Environmental Outlook, and currently as an associate professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability at Colorado State University. Dr. Bowser has a strong record of international fieldwork, top publications and funding, and is respected as a global leader in our field. And in recognition of her commitment to increasing the diversity of ecologists through mentoring, teaching, and outreach, Dr. Bowser was honored with the Ecological Society of America's Commitment to Human Diversity in Ecology Award. And unfortunately, in this webinar format, we cannot give her the loud and warm welcome that she deserves, but please join me in spirit as I welcome Dr. Bowser and all of you virtually to NCEAS. And Gillian, I'll leave it to you to take it from here and share your screen.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the wonderful and warm introduction. So I will switch over and share a screen and go ahead and get started. So I want to, again, say thank you so much for the invitation, and it is a great honor and a pleasure to talk to everyone about these topics that are near and dear to my heart. I also want to make sure I acknowledge that Colorado State University sits on the homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Ute people, and we acknowledge the importance of these as a traditional place for gathering. And through this acknowledgement, we like to pay back to those generations of future Ute people and Arapaho who live on these lands. So I want to just start and talk a little about environmental justice, and in specifically what we call ecological blind spots. And I wanted to talk that first by also acknowledging, along with the land that the university sits on, the people who played a very powerful and important role in my own life, including my PhD advisors, my mentors at the National Park Service, and then others, collaborators and partners who helped, move through the journey of ecology in my own career. But I like to start thinking about this talk about, we talk about our identities, and we like to introduce ourselves with our identities, or we use pronouns or other things. And so I like to start to talk about how I see my identity. I think it becomes important when we think about what is an ecological mindset, what is the blind spot for ecology, and how do diverse people become part of this field. So you know, we think about like an academic identity. We all define ourselves like, I'm an ecologist, or I'm an entomologist, or I'm a plant biologist, or so forth. I guess I would define myself as a high elevation ecologist. Most of my research takes place in pretty high areas, from Yellowstone National Park, the Huscarán National Park in Peru, which is at 16,000 feet, Beartooth Plateau at 12,000 feet, and Grand Teton National Park. And I love looking at the impacts of high elevation systems and the impacts of climate change on those systems. But I also define myself as a Black kid from Brooklyn. And even though my Ranger Rick card is a little bit expired, it does show this sort of the history of, you know, way back when I defined myself as being sort of excited about these things. I had my Ranger Rick card, and I was going to be part of the Ranger Rick Club way back when, even being from Brooklyn. So you could say being Black from Brooklyn, I would say my identity is BB2, and I'm being a little bit sort of fun and cheek here. But as I've gone through my career, I started Yellowstone National Park, mainly working on a campsite inventory, which is another whole story of starting the Park Service without ever having backpacked in your life. But I've studied organisms from bisons to butterflies, worked a lot with bears, not necessarily voluntarily working with bears in Yellowstone, did backpack and work with birds and binoculars. So if you look at all that, you start to see maybe my identity or my pronouns is really about being a Black biologist, a butterflyer with backpacks, binoculars, birds, bear sprays, and from Brooklyn, or a BB8. And I'd like to start talks about diversity and ecology, about thinking about that, because my identity as a Black ecologist is inseparable. The intersectionality means that I cannot separate these different multiple parts of my identity. And why that becomes really important is when we look at underrepresentation in a field, and we look at persistent underrepresentation in a field, asking that question about identity is what I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about today. So part of what we're asking today is about, and I will say that I'm going to focus mostly on Blacks in natural resources, African Americans, and people who identify themselves as such. And I would also urge that everyone think at the end of this talk that there's a woven braid. One of those strands might be African Americans, but another strand might be Native Americans, another strand is Hispanics, and others, people who are underrepresented in those fields. And those strands are not the same, they're not different, they weave together to tell one story. But I think the overarching 20, 30, 40,000 foot view needs to be asked, why does all this matter? So I'll come back to this. Why does a blind spot about diversity matter in a field like ecology that chases bugs or bears or so forth and around? And I want to quote my colleague, Dr. Michael Brandon Jones from the National Science Foundation, who said that individuals are not able to bring all of themselves to the research enterprise because they can't be all of themselves. And this is why diversity matters for the research enterprise, the scientific enterprise of innovation and discovery in the United States. If everyone is not able to bring all of themselves into that research enterprise, it hinders both the individual and the enterprise. So I want to take a look at in ecological blind spots and talk about a little bit of why does this lack of diversity matter in the ecological scientific enterprise. And to start, I want to make sure that we're all at the sort of same page. So I'm going to use the foundation of the National Science Reports that are done every year on women, minorities, and persons with disabilities, and sort of set the stage for why this conversation is so important, particularly right now, for us to have about diversity in the ecological fields. So I think we have to come to sort of a good understanding of who's underrepresented and make sure we're clear. So underrepresented minorities defined in the sciences, and we're just talking about US citizenship and not, you know, any political other than defining our scientific enterprise as African American, Hispanic or Latinx, Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders. It's important to note in, again, how we define ourselves as who's represented and who's underrepresented, that Asian Americans currently are this rather vast group that includes China, Japan, India, and all associated countries on the Asian continent. So when you talk about the term Asian American, remember this, it's a very broad term from people with very, very many different cultural identities. But they currently, as a group, are not considered underrepresented in the sciences. And it's also important to note that neither National Science Foundation nor AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, tracks sexual orientation in the sciences. They do track disabilities, mostly mobile disabilities, but they do not track sexual orientation in the sciences. And that's an internal issue for NSF to discuss, but I think when we just talk about underrepresented in terms of numbers, I'm focusing on these groups as identified by NSF. So here are the numbers, and I think they're really interesting and important for us to pay attention to, especially in the ecological sciences. So in 2013, the scientific enterprise for all the sciences, this is everybody, including engineering, whoops, sorry about that, shows that white men are running about 51% of the total scientific enterprise, and everybody else falls into another group. With most of the, if you look at women, like Hispanic women and Black women, representing about 3% of the total scientific enterprise. But if you look at just how degrees were earned since the year 2000, those numbers for all minorities, that entire piece, except for Asian Americans, means that at the doctoral level, it still hasn't quite broken 4%. So if you look at the doctorate level in this graphic, those numbers have barely changed since the year 2000. And the current peak is still running right around 4% of the total number of doctorates that are graduating in the sciences. So what does that look like? It's important to think about two things here. Number one is that if you look at African Americans or Black American doctoral recipients, 40% of all of those who earn a PhD in any of the earth sciences have an origin in the HBU system. So again, think about, of the 4% of those who earn a doctorate degree, almost half come out of the HBU system as an undergraduate for African Americans. So it shows just how tight that reach is of who actually makes it all the way through. And this graphic is actually a little more scary to think about. So this is all of the employment status of science and engineers by ethnicity and race, and the year is 2017. And at the time of this graphic, this is 5 years past the first graphic, the number of white females in the sciences went from 20% to 40%. So that number almost doubled, while the total number of representation in the scientific field is hovering right around 70%, and everybody else falls in that category. And you can see where Asian American becomes a sort of a large category, but remembering that's many, many cultural groups that sit in that category. But the one that I highlighted here that's worth thinking about is the number of people who are not employed, who are scientists, we're talking PhD level scientists, who are not employed, but are currently still looking. And in 2017, that was 40%. So of the 4% of all the minorities in the sciences, half are still looking for a job in the sciences. So it's an important thing to think about. So I think we need to ask about this intersection of race and gender and ask what that means for the discipline as a whole, and ask what it means for us to move forward for the discipline as a whole. So sort of in summary of these numbers, the overall number of women of color is so low that neither NSF nor AAAS can analyze the individual groups. Native Americans can list less than 1% of all of these numbers. When you think of the doctorates, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, it becomes even harder to figure out what those individual numbers are. At the same time, there's great celebration for our advancement of gender in the sciences. White women have doubled their numbers in the sciences, to the point that in the year 2020, an estimated 60% of the graduate students in the earth sciences today for all the earth scientists are white or Caucasian. So let's take a look at what some of those total numbers look like. For example, if you go to the agricultural sciences, of 763 doctorate degrees nationwide, 45 were Black. And if you look at the geosciences, of 760 degrees, 11 were Black. And then if you ask how many of those were women and a minority, this is Tashiana Osborne, who's currently from Scripps Institute there in California. She'll be one of 5 female atmospheric scientists graduated nationwide, to give you an idea of those numbers. So this becomes a sort of a double blind when you think about women in color and sciences and identity, going back to my own identity at BB8, is that trend for women has bisected itself. So where we have incredible successes and points for celebration for the movement and the representative of women in terms of gender in the sciences, with 60% or more. Colorado State, we're currently about 65% of our undergraduates are female, and our graduate students are about 70 and higher % female in the natural resource sciences. So the trend for African Americans of color is the opposite. So in Colorado State University, we currently, of that 65% female, we have 0 African Americans, 0. So the trend is very different for the women of color than it is for the women. This is why when I talk about my identity first, to say it's so important for me that identity, I cannot separate being Black and being female as identity as a scientist, because there's so few. Our trends are in opposite direction, and that leads me to my next point in this talk. So why don't Black people like the earth sciences? And I used to be able to put this slide up. This is from several years ago from Rocky Mountain National Park. And most people sort of get a chuckle. It's supposed to be a fun slide. But then in May of this year, something happened that I think finally people are starting to see why this slide is actually fairly serious. And the same day in May, in the year 2000, 2 things happened. And this is where our ecological blind spots come in. One was an incident in Central Park, and the second was George Floyd. And it's really sort of a fascinating point of history that these 2 things occurred on top of each other, because the underlying mechanisms are still the same. And this is why we as ecologists simply haven't seen before that event why we should be worried as an ecologist about policing, or why should we be worried as an ecologist about Black activism, or educational policies, or achievement gaps, or all this other stuff that as ecologists we weren't as worried about. We were still kind of worried about, well, maybe if we got them into nature more, wherever they were, that would change, and that would change our diversity as a scientist. But all of these things, whether it's policing, affirmative action, admissions, hiring, et cetera, all connect to this lack of diversity. So a colleague of mine, Drew Lampton from Clemson University, he said it best, and he actually just came out with another set of 9 rules, literally just today, also in Orion magazine. And his 9 rules for Black birders came out, or birdwatchers, came out in 2013. And it was the most downloaded article for that magazine in 2020 after the incident with Chris Cooper in Central Park. And I highlighted one of those, and I hopefully urge you all to take a look if you're interested in this topic. Obviously one is always be prepared to be confused with the other Black birder. Yes, true. There are probably about 3 African-American women, and we all get confused with each other, though Maria is much taller than I am. Number 2 is if you carry your binoculars, you always also carry 3 forms of identification. And that is so true. I could tell you how many times we've been stopped by police in remote location. And number 3 is thinking about Trevor Martin, a name that in terms of Black activism, people should be familiar with, is don't ever, ever bird in a hoodie. And number 4 is nocturnal birding is a no-no. And he has 9 of these, and I just highlighted 4 of them, because of thinking about what happened with Chris Cooper and what has sort of changed the dialogue to where we are today, is thinking about these things. All of a sudden, this issue of why people do not participate in the science came a little bit more to the forefront. So these issues of social justice and social factors impact our identity as being a scientist, and how we look at that and how it identifies our professional development is currently true for a narrow group of scientists versus for all scientists. And so I'll spend the rest of my talk talking about these four things. So one is the role of the field experience in the ecological sciences, and particularly the earth sciences. Number two, talk about this sort of issue of belonging, belonging in a group. Number three, the sense of place in ecological instruction. And number four, it's identifying as a scientist or a field ecologist. And the reason why I want to bring this back in terms of how we talk about environmental justice and other fields that are important in the ecological setup is because we as the ecologists tend to operate in these two bubbles highlighted in pink and never connect to the other bubbles or the central bubble, which is environmental justice, that impact some of our colleagues differently than they impact others. And I think that's what we need to highlight. So in a recent book on unsustainable inequalities, talked about this sort of lack of connection. And I would argue that in the ecological scientific enterprise, our blind spot, as demonstrated in this graphic here, is running through this purple line that we can look at biophysical elements, we can look at ecosystem services or processes, carbon cycling, carbon storage, and run it through to global environmental justice and simply bypass environmental justice and social justice issues. We never consider them in our scholarship. And this is a blind spot that appears when we think about the impact of sustainability on communities and vice versa, that broader impact problem that different funding agencies make us address. So this is our blind spot, that we don't see the connection of ecosystem services and ecological research with social justice or environmental justice issues. We simply don't see it within the field, and that impacts the attraction of that field for different groups of people. So I think I want to go back to Brendan Jones' comment about the scientific enterprise, and also ask the question of the creation of scientific knowledge within that enterprise is very much defined by what we see and by what we don't see. So where do we decide to study? What do we decide to study? What do we define as the broader impacts of our research? And then who benefits by all the above? And when we think about the scientific enterprise, we tend to not think about how important the who the asking the question is to decide what we study and what we don't study. You know, and we'll talk about some examples later on, but it's so important to think about just what we don't see, what do we not know that informs our research is amazing when you think about how blind we can be, especially when it comes to environmental justice that takes an ecosystem processes and makes it dangerous for a human community operating within that same ecosystem space. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of this, where these pieces come in, and then return my focus more to what makes people whole and how we think about issues like systematic racism in the field experience or other things that we talk about, but maybe we need to think about a little bit more holistically. So, and again, being a little bit sort of on the lighter side, these are all 5 sayings that I've heard people, in some cases, was tell to me directly, that the lack of performance of people of color in the field can be attributed to, well, Black people just don't go outside, or Hispanic people don't like the cold, and urban kids or inner city kids or any of the above just need more nature. If we got them involved in more nature, they would get turned on and suddenly become ecologists. And my favorite one is that Black people can't wash their hair. And the sad thing is I was told that last year at a professional conference. So this is a conversation that happens all the time. It's like, oh yeah, the Black kids don't like to go to our field station because they can't buy shampoo. And you sort of look at someone like that and say, well, you have heard of Amazon, right? But another one that my former employer, the National Park Service, used to do all the time, they would say, well, if we build bigger picnic tables, this was a project of the National Park Service, we'll get more Hispanic people showing up in the park. So they went out and built bigger picnic tables. Or people of different abilities simply cannot participate in the scientific enterprise without even asking what that ability might or might not be. So I want to take again a look at intersections of identity and ask about human or student health, well-being, and how that impacts their participation in the sciences and why that's so important. I want to focus on 4 things: identity, belonging, place, and security. And I'm going to acknowledge my colleagues. So this is a group project. It's certainly not my own scholarship. It's a bunch of us from San Francisco State University, your colleagues up the road from you guys in Berkeley, Colorado State, and the University of Minnesota that are working together on this project called Voices, which is looking at voices of inclusion and culture in the earth sciences. And we look at 4 things. We ask the question about what is the sense of identity as a scientist? What is the sense of identity in terms of belonging in that discipline? What is the connection to place? And what's that sense of security? And these are things that I think move in the underrepresented person space in a way that is very different than a majority's space, who may not think about how these 4 things move around. And a great example, again, is to think about gender. Where we talk about, women need to see themselves as scientists, and we put them in white lab coats and think, aha, now we see everybody thinking about a scientist. But we haven't really asked about that. What if it's a Black woman or a Black child? And how do you think about that identity as a scientist? So identity is the first one. So a clue, the scientist is the one on the left, or you're right. But identity can be, in terms of this connections with that professional discipline, this where environmental justice becomes such an important driver of what we think about. So who identifies the questions and why those questions can be influential on someone wanting to go out to save the planet, save the community, or become sustainable? Maybe that identity with the community as well as being identity as a scientist. So getting those voices into who identifies the question is such an important part of an identity paradigm. And the second is this issue of belonging. I work mostly with teams of students, and part of the reason we do that is it gives our students relief from being the only. So if you have a highly diverse team of students, you don't have an imposter, you don't have a solo student, you have a mixture of students. So this issue of belonging can be a major driver on how students feel they can be successful or not successful in the field. Do I want to stay in this field, or do I want to leave it? And the field experience for most earth sciences can be this make or break point. I don't want to be the only Black person in a field in the middle of rural Wyoming. I may just not want to be that. But if I have a team of students, and this picture is from rural Wyoming, then it's a different experience. It's a different way of thinking about things. And place is one that we'll spend more time on, and one that I hope as part of our land acknowledgements at the beginning of this talk that we think more about is this understanding of place and understanding the connections of place, and that those are different for different people and different cultural heritage. So when we talk about place, to think about how those differences. And I like to talk about that every landscape has culture. And the question is whether we see it. And if we forget to see it, we don't tell its story. And if we don't tell its story, we don't create that sense of belonging to a landscape. And we talk about traditional landscapes, but that tradition may be recent. Maybe it's a Buffalo Soldier. Maybe it's a relative or a worker from the Chinese railroads who crossed these Great Plains when the buffalo were still running. So understanding what place means and how it means to different people. And I love this slide because this is from one of my first national parks. But just that simple importance of place and tying people to a place. So Director Stanton, who was the first African-American director of the National Park Service, started his job in Grand Teton National Park. And for me as another African-American to see his picture in Grand Teton National Park and have that park celebrate his groundbreaking journey through the National Park Service was a really important idea of place and making that place important. This is the plaque that they put up in his honor. And the second one, the fourth one gets us back to Chris Cooper and security and what happened in Central Park on that day and why that is so important. And that importance of Central Park that reverberated through protests tied to George Floyd, but represented for the Black community the same problem of policing, security in places where being Black made a difference, driving while Black, walking while Black, or whatever it was that made that difference. And having the police being called on you is a security issue for you, not the other person. As understanding that in different regions of this great country, these are still issues that we have to deal with every day. And so security means safety for most minorities. It's very different. I was asked, working in Yellowstone for 11 years, what was it that I feared the most on a trail? And this is in a park with grizzly bears and everything else. And I would still say to this day, what I fear the most on the trail, if I'm hiking solo or hiking, in a small group, is running into a white person on that trail. And in parts of Yellowstone, that's a real fear. And in parts of Wyoming, that's a real fear. Never ever wear a hoodie while butterflying or birding because of that fear. It's still a mantra that we think about today. This is one of my field students from this year. So when we think about environmental justice and why it's an ecological blind spot, it's this inability to tie these two together. We tend to think about it from our science perspective and not from the student perspective. So I'm going to close out my talk with a little bit of discussion about that student perspective and be mindful of time here. So the current hotspot is everybody wants to talk about Jedi, and I'm a huge Star Wars fan, so I love this discussion about Jedi. Everybody's like, yeah, we're going to do Jedi, justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and this is going to solve the diversity in the sciences. But I want to argue that maybe Jedi is not the right approach. All Jedi does is look at the science. How do we create justice within the science? How do we create diversity within the science? How do we create equity within the science? How do we create inclusion within the science? But we haven't opened the door to people who don't currently walk through it. And maybe we need to rethink Jedi and change it to what I call belonging, efficacy, place, and identity. How do we change a sense of belonging, self-efficacy? I can do this. Place, I connect to this place, and identity as a scientist. So my argument is that we currently still look at the field experience, and the we being both those of us who administer field experiences without thinking about it. And we still want to get to Jedi, but we don't need to be at Jedi. We need to be someplace else. And we need to think about this from the student's perspective, from that student walking through that door for the first time into the state of Wyoming or the state of Montana or state of wherever, but it's different from wherever they are from. And they are the imposter. They're the one who stands out. And asking the question, are we thinking about Jedi? Or should we really be thinking about, do they feel like they belong? Are they comfortable here? Do they feel secure here? And what is the it that we need to address as a discipline? So I think the ecological blindness, our blind spot, is that we define our science and then we want to overlay it with Jedi and think that this will solve our diversity issues. And I argue that this is the wrong approach. We need to look at the individual and ask the question of identities and belonging, and then interconnect that with our science to be able to change the diversity of their sciences. So in summary, I'm going to think about ecological blind spots is that the scientific enterprise, and especially as we look at changing climates, especially as we look at increasing urban environments, and especially as we look at national parks being increasingly surrounded, threatened by changing environments, changing urbanization, pollution, et cetera. To get to the questions, we need to be representative of all cultures and society. As a National Park Service employee, one of the things that we talked about all the time is that the National Park Services are paid for by the public, even though the time parks were created, the public was not truly everybody in the 1860s. But now we've defined the public as everybody, and we need to be reflective of everybody in our park staff, our park programming, and our park visitation. And I argue that ecological field needs to think about itself the same way. Ecology belongs to everybody, nature belongs to everybody. So those of us who protect her, who want to understand her, and want to be able to make her available for future generations, it should be reflective of the everybody. So maybe we need to rethink Jedi, and you need to think about it as a way that we look at students who want to belong as part of the field. And then I want to close with this issue of the language of landscapes, of place. And I think this is something that we as ecologists particularly tend to overlook. So I'm going to close, and I'll apologize in advance because I cannot sing, but I want us to think about the wade in the river. So let's think about a river for a second. And I use the term wade into a river, and some of you may know where that comes from. When we think about a river, we think about it as an ecosystem resource that carries water, that is part of a community, that carries organisms, that can be part of a food system, et cetera. But it's nevertheless an important part of our ecological view of the world. But if we take that wade into the river and say, wade into the river, and ask where that came from, that same river now has 3 different meanings. Wade into the river is about freedom. But that river could also be about water is life for the people of the Standing Rock Nation. Or that river could be about rafting and recreation for a general public that currently visits our parks. So I think if you look at that river and just ask the question of which cultural landscape that river is in, you can see that that river crosses many cultural landscapes, and it's seen in different places, and it blends different things. And if we actually bring that into our ways of knowing about a river, we will bring different people into our discipline. So I want to close on the comment that was actually made by a very famous Nigerian storyteller who talked about the single story. And she said that your stereotypes are not untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. I think in ecology that we've created a stereotype, but it's incomplete. It only tells the one story, the lack of diversity within our field, and it makes it become the only story. But there are so many other stories there. We can wade into that river of so many other stories to tell about so many different people who connect to nature in so many different ways. So I want to close with acknowledging support by the National Science Foundation. Also, I'm very fortunate to have the most amazing group of students in the world, known as the pollinator hotshots, who run around and chase pollinators, but it's also part of the Lewis-Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation in the Sciences and the Rocky Mountain Sustainable and Science Network that are also both funded by the National Science Foundation. So with that, I will stop my share and see if there's time for questions, and sort of, I think I'll turn my video on, but maybe mute.
Great, thank you so much. I'll applaud on behalf of everyone. Thanks for that great talk. I think, so yeah, please, people drop in your questions into the Q&A, and I can pose them to Dr. Bowser. But while those are coming in, I guess something I wanted to ask is something that we've been thinking about at NCEAS that I'm sure people at institutions all across ecology are thinking about is kind of what steps we can take as individuals and as institutions to think about JEDI, but I really like this idea of thinking about, you know, belonging and place and identity too. So if you have any kind of recommendations or conversations we should be having right now, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is not thinking about JEDI in sort of my opinion, because, you know, if you take the 30,000 foot view, our population is becoming increasingly urban. Lots of data on that. So most people are coming from an urban landscape or from a different place. But we still want to talk about this issue of discovering nature. Like, okay, you need to go discover nature to become an ecologist. And for many of us, that does become a linchpin. But we have to get people to walk through that door first. So we need to think about, so for example, when we interview students to come to a job, are we asking them, do they know how to backpack, or do they know how to set up a tent? Or do we ask them, how do they want to be a leader? How do they want to do something for their community? How do they want to co-create some cool science questions? See, now just change the dialogue from JEDI to, I don't know how you'd pronounce that, BP or something like that, to ask the question differently. Because if you're looking for the science as a way of inquiry, a way of knowing, a way of asking questions, then the skill sets that we still tend to associate with ecology really are not important. What's really important is how that person is thinking about that landscape and something different. So thank you for that. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think that's what I like to think about.
It's good food for thought. Yeah, I think so. We have another question coming in that I guess is kind of dovetails on that. And we have someone who's interested in a little bit more about, I guess, your own experiences, to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing, coming to feel a sense of belonging, or any barriers that you felt along the way, and how you might approach them, or any recommendations you might have for other kind of people of color navigating these waters.
Well, I think that the tricky part is, getting back to, excuse me, those two different terminologies. So my generation is, a bunch of the older farts of the Park Service and other things. When we came in, and actually there was a survey that went out recently that asked, a bunch of us in the Black ecologists grouping, if any one of us could remember if we ever had a Black professor, and in the sciences. And for most of us, the first Black professor that we remembered was in graduate school or higher. That means you went through your entire undergraduate career with no mentorship of anybody who looked like you. I don't think this generation needs to go through that. I think they should be able to ask for mentorship of someone who shares their life experience, who shares their life identity. And maybe it's somebody in a different scientific field. So I think in some cases that past lesson shouldn't be valid anymore. They shouldn't have to go alone. You should never ask anybody to go to, I was in Yellowstone for 11 years, but I had fabulous mentors, the people at the beginning of the slide, who were really important to be able to help people survive in a place like Yellowstone for many years. But I think this newer generation should not have to go through that. So what do we put into place to make sure they're safe? I think that is the big issue. And I'll segue for a quick story on just how important this is. So Chris Cooper happened in May. In July, I took a group of students to Yellowstone National Park in a caravan of cars to try and make our health things work. Lead car is driven by a blonde woman. The tail car is driven by a Hispanic. They come around a corner and see a state trooper, right? So he hits his lights, everybody stops. All Colorado State universities lined up, big cars. So state trooper walks past the white student and looks at her, walks to the rear vehicle and asks the last driver for her papers. This is in Wyoming. So she's a young Hispanic woman. She gets a ticket. He runs her papers. He wants to know where her passport is. And the white woman in the front is crying because you can see this whole thing going on. He never talked to the other driver. And all the students are watching this. So this is a very real issue. That student was terrified of what was going to happen when that state trooper came up. And there were other students in the car and we didn't know what their status was. We had a lot of Hispanic students. So this was a traumatic experience for them, but we were a group. We had a sense of belonging. We could sit after the state trooper left. We all sat on the side of the road and shared that experience and asked, why was this so powerful? And had the students had the trust to share it among each other. So we all grew. We all grew from that. But see, that's an experience that as an African-American, I have a different response to that than Hispanic-American. I was less engaged, and I should have been more engaged, on the fact that he kept asking her for her citizenship papers than me, and I'm worried about driving while Black in Wyoming. So you see how those different experiences really make huge impacts. So I think bringing our students together so that they have that support, so when an incident like that happens, that they have the support to make it through. Thanks. Sorry, a bit of a segue.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot of questions coming in now, so I'm going to try and get to as many as possible. Fortunately, we still have quite a bit of time. Yeah, I guess just to kind of dovetail on what you were just talking about, someone's asking how we can, as a community of scientists, ensure safety and security for people of color, especially Black people. And I guess I'll kind of dovetail on this. I guess what is the role that white people can play? People in the majorities, men, especially white men, to advance kind of belonging and place in these conversations?
That's a great question, and thank you guys thank you whoever asked that. There was a bad movie with a great title that actually I like to use as an example. And I can't even remember what the movie was about. It's about something stupid. But the title of the movie was called Eyes Wide Shut. And I think it's such a wonderful analogy for what we need to do in the ecologies. And this issue of eyes wide shut. So we just had a training that we held recently for people who run the field experience. And I asked them, so when I drive, every year I take students back to Wyoming, to Yellowstone, like the incident I just talked about, in part because I worked in Yellowstone for 11 years and love the place, but also because they all do research on my old research sites. And then when I drive from Wyoming, we cut across Wyoming because there's no direct route. And I'm very mindful of where I stop. So I asked this group of field people, and you guys can all think about it. I'm driving across, got 21 kids in the car, mostly minorities, and someone has to use the restroom. Where do you stop? And this gets to eyes wide shut. So if I'm driving across that country and I pull into a gas station in the state of Wyoming with a Confederate flag, what have I just done? What have I just changed? I actually just changed that whole sense of belonging. I've actually just changed that whole experience. Because whatever your opinion is, for African Americans, the presence of that Confederate flag is very important. There's a gas station right outside of Rocky Mountain National Park that has a Confederate flag in its parking lot. I never stopped there. So in other words, eyes wide shut means that I need to have eyes wide open as the leader of an experience to make sure that I'm not conflicting that experience. It's not my job to argue with that gas station owner on why he has that flag there. It's not an argument that I think I need to make, because as a Park Service person, my #1 job is safety. I need to get those students safe. I need to get them there safely. I get them returned safely. So when I think about when I drive across country, where do I stop? I stop on the interstate highway. I don't care if anybody's got to pee yet. We're stopping. This is a pee stop. Everybody get out and pee. Because I know when I hit that rural Wyoming, if I have to pull into a gas station, I've got a potential for a conflict, and I don't want to get there. So the fun side of that story is there's another gas station further up in Wyoming, in the town of Du Bois, very friendly place that also sells fudge. So I stop there with advanced students every year, and we wipe them out of fudge. I mean, 21 hungry students, and we clean them out. But that owner is very friendly, very welcoming. And that difference is really apparent when you walk into a gas station in a rural community with 21 Black kids or 21 minority kids. So eyes wide shut would be a #1 rule, is to realize that you may not see things and try and teach yourself to see things. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't driven outside of Rocky Mountain National Park and not noticed that flag, then you're not doing your students a service.
That's fantastic. And we have one of the participants just dropped in a Maya Angelou quote, and without willing it, I went from being ignorant of being ignorant to being aware of being aware, which I think is really nice.
Yeah.
For that.
And, or I can't remember who said, you need to know what you don't know to know that you don't know it.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try and consolidate these as much as possible. But questions about sense of play. Wait, I just lost them. Where did it go? Yeah, your comment about sense of place and really resonating, and how it's easier to kind of embrace science in a given place if we understand how the land and sea around us move. And so I guess what do you do as a leader? What can we do to instill senses of place in students who might be in environments that are totally new to them? And how also can we incorporate and involve the people, who are indigenous to that land and acknowledge their sense of the place too?
Thank you for that question. That's an awesome question. I certainly encourage you also, if you ever get a chance to hear my colleague, Wendy Smythe, to talk from the Haida Nation. So Native American culture and African American culture are fundamentally different things. I wanted to be very cautious. I'll speak from an African American cultural perspective of place versus Native American cultural perspective of place. But the one thing I would say about that to think about as you sort of move forward is, so it's been coming out quite a bit. People will use the term decolonizing or colonialism. Black people were not part of colonialism. We were property. We lost all of our culture. We have no cultural connections to this country. So I think what African American cultural connection is American cultural connection, which is firmly and solidly based in slavery. Whereas for Native American cultural connection is based in their ancestral lands that they owned before the United States came up. So these are just different. it's not a better or worse, or one evil versus another. They're just different. So my sense of place is when my people have passed there. So another sort of beautiful story is you go to Yellowstone National Park and you go to the Mammoth hot springs in the Yellowstone National Park. Who helped build that fort was actually a bunch of African-American soldiers. Like they actually managed Yosemite National Park. But the cool part of the story, which makes for a lot of connection, is how did those African-American soldiers get there? I don't know if anyone knows this story. In the 1890s, how did they get there? They got there by bicycle. So there's this amazing photographs of these African-Americans, Buffalo soldiers with bicycles standing on Minerva Terrace. That the Park Service is just starting to tell that story. It's like, how did this happen? Who moved here? So understanding that Black people moved across the West as an expression of freedom. We waded across that river to freedom. The West was a free place during the entire Civil War. And retelling that story, my colleague Sheldon Johnson retells the story again and again about Yosemite. That Yosemite was managed by African Americans for 11 years. Most African Americans know this story, and they go to Yosemite to see that place. So I think it's understanding those stories and the cultural footprints and where those cultural footprints went for different people, and then helping share that to your students is so important. So again, think about it as an ecologist. You could take a simple animal like the beaver and ask, what does the beaver represent in different cultures? It's not just that the beaver represented a culture for Native American cultures, it was also represented as an economic way of life, a free life for the early African-American fur trappers. The Jim Beckworth, who was based here in Denver, who explored and was literate, who explored most of the West. So understanding these pieces and helping your students see that piece that, yes, your ancestors, whoever they were, the Chinese Americans who built the railroads, they were here. Why are we not telling their stories to allow our Chinese students or our Asian connected students to understand that their history is here too? It's not just about the Native, and it is about the Native American landscape. It's about the intersection of the braid of all of these landscapes. As I said, that river tells so many different stories. We as ecologists should celebrate all those stories. It's water for life, for Standing Rock. It's freedom for other people.
Thank you for that. I think that, yeah, that's fantastic. I think, okay, so let me move through these. Okay, so we've got a question. This one's a little bit more personal. This question comes from a Latino woman who's working for the Park Service and is curious to know
Park Service!
how you navigate white spaces that can feel lonely. Lonely in the sense that if you're the only person of color in this field, and if you have any advice out there to people that are, of course, ideally, you're never the only one, but for many people that is the experience right now. So do you have any advice to them?
Somewhat advice. So when I was in Yellowstone, I was the only African-American for a long time. Then Sheldon Johnson showed up in Yellowstone. So there are only 2 of us in the park for a long time out of 400 and some odd employees. And in the winter, we were the only person in the park. So we used to have a great time getting into all sorts of mischief about, being the only Black person in the entire state. But I think part of the question is in the Park Service is that they are, at least more so than in academia, there are linkages among people in the Park Service, and there are people who care about that. J.T. Reynolds was the superintendent of Death Valley National Park, who would come back and just sort of check on me and make sure that I was surviving okay in Yellowstone National Park. And actually the former director of the National Park Service, John Jarvis, when he went to civil service, what they call the selective service of the federal government, they're asked to mentor people. And he was my mentor for years. I could call him up even when he became the director and say, hey, John, this is going on. Can you give me a hand? So in the Park Service world, mentorship matters. And it's usually mentorship is someone in a different park in a different place to help you navigate those park spaces, because the park spaces are rough. I mean, I worked in Yellowstone, I worked in Badlands. Badlands, can't tell you how many times I got called the N-word. Those are rough places. Those are rough parks to work at, but celebrating the Park Service family, I think, is an important piece. And I think there's a lot to be said about this for our students as well, to think about that bigger family of ecologists. There are a lot of people trying to make a difference and trying hard to make that difference. They may not be at your institution. they may be at another institution. And maybe that's what we need to do more of, is celebrate linkages across institutions. I'm the only African-American female in the entire College of Natural Resources at Warner College, which is a little bit ridiculous. And there's one African-American male in the entire college, in the faculty. So there are 2 of us in the entire college faculty of over 100 faculty members. So it doesn't get any better. But what makes it better is when you make these connections. And I know I've got a colleague of mine, Dr. Medina, who's online, because he sent me a text message. And that's someone who, we've tracked each other through universities for years. So, having a colleague like Raul and others that keep you sane. So it's not a great answer. The short answer is yes, it's quite rough.
Yeah, I think, okay, so we've got another question kind of, I guess, building on that, but we have one of the participants is working a lot with high school youth of color in the sciences. And they're expressed concern that because of these students' own lived experiences and intergenerational trauma, they've already shut the door to careers in science or the environment. And if you have any thoughts on short-term interventions that can be implemented to advocate for high school students and college students and young adults to keep that door open for them as we're working on this kind of longer timescales to change institutions and cultures.
That is an awesome question, and I apologize. I think I sent you my slides, and I think on my slides, and feel free to distribute the slides because I put references on the bottom of a lot of the slides. So there was an article in Science Magazine not too long ago called by a guy named Walton and Cohen called "Brief Interventions," and his argument was that brief interventions matter, and they make an enormous difference on how people perceive themselves. And we tend to want to think too much long-term. And his argument was that a brief intervention makes an enormous difference. So in his little study, what he did was change around who was considered in an honors class and who was not considered in an honors class. And what he found is that, student performance increased if they thought they were honor students, even if they actually weren't. And so his argument, and this was even more so for minority students. And a similar study actually was done for Asian communities in India with the caste system to show that it's how students identify, getting back to this issue of identity, how they identify themselves, which also leads to their performance. So I think the thing to think about is that we still define scientists, and I actually love doing this, and a lot of my colleagues will have a similar, so it's not something I'd learned on my own, I've learned with a bunch of colleagues, that if we create a student team and ask them to ask a question, that the science is about the inquiry, the asking the question. It's not about the data. So it's trying to get students to see that. So instead of trying to throw data at them, if we can get them that sense of self-efficacy, of self-confidence to ask a question. So a good example is we take students to Yellowstone every year. Here we had them, their little project that they came up with, we give them tools like trail cams and so forth, and say, go out and figure out a question. It's really fun. You get absolute gobbledygook. But a lot of them have a lot of fun asking this question. So we had a little bat camera, and the question was, do something with bats. We don't care what it is, but figure it out. And they decided to find out how many bats were in Yellowstone National Park. It's a very super cool little cam. It actually works really well. But the issue was at the end of this, they got like zero data. I mean, their data was horrible, but they had a great time running around trying to find bat roosts. They had a fabulous time. And when we did our evaluation afterwards at the end, and we do a whole series of evaluation, ask this question about self-efficacy, the students define themselves as scientists because they learned how to ask the question. So I think as scientists, and going back to the high schools, we focus so much on data that we forget that the process of inquiry should be what we celebrate, even if their data is crap. And another quick story, we had a bunch of students who decided they were going to find out if pikas really do move with elevation. So they put out a bunch of trail cams, and all they got were marmots. Marmots love trail cams. So they got 0 pikas and about 200 marmots on their trail cams. So again, walking them through the fun of learning that you asked a question, you learned how to put it in the field, you learned how to analyze the data, and you got whatever you got at the end of the day, and it was all okay. You could still identify the science process. So it's the focus on the process and not on the result. And I think for high school students, that's even more important, because then they can celebrate the end, and they still laugh about the bat students are pretty funny. They still laugh about it. Yeah, we got 0 bats after a lot of nights out there. but it's important to change that dialogue to make them feel like, wow, you guys were so successful. Yeah, you got 0 bats, but you guys had a great time out there and they learned a lot about bat biology at the time. So thank you for that question. That's actually a fun one to think about differently.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. Unfortunately, we have so many questions that we weren't able to get to, but I think we can, I don't know, Cordy, if we can save these for later and maybe, follow up offline. The recording.
I'm happy if you want to send them, I'm happy to try and give them a shot with our team from that project.
Yeah, that would be really fantastic, because I feel bad that we weren't able to get to them all. We're getting lots of thank yous. And again, want to just say thank you, Dr. Bowser, for the talk. I'm glad we had plenty of time for Q&A. Thanks to everyone for joining. And yeah, I think we got up to like 160 people at some point, which was amazing.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I also just want to invite everyone to join us again on March 3rd. Dr. Chris Schell will be speaking about wealth, race, and wildlife, the impacts of structural inequality on urban wildlife. So yeah, it'll be, the link is on the same website. So join us in a month. And yeah, again, I'm sorry we can't give you the loud round of applause that you deserve.
Well, thank you.
Ben
thank
and
you
I will
for
do
hosting.
it. And thank you everyone for joining today. And the link to this will be, the recording will be online for those that want to share it further with others who couldn't make it.
Well, thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, ciao.